A single, unearthly bell tolls across the dark age mists of England. This is the haunting heart of one of the nation's oldest and most persistent ghost stories, the legend of the Bell Witch of Wessex. By the end of this journey, you will unravel the layers of this medieval mystery, separating eerie folklore from possible history. We will walk with a terrified Saxon family, listen to phantom knocks and spectral voices, and examine why this tale of a cursed homestead has echoed for over 1,000 years. What kind of fear takes root so deeply that it outlives empires? Our story unfolds not in a vague, misty past, but in a specific and deeply uncertain time. It is the 8th century in the ancient kingdom of Wessex. Picture a land of rolling green hills and deep, shadowy forests of oak and ash, a world where the Roman roads are crumbling and the great stone cities are abandoned ruins, slowly being swallowed by the earth. This is England in the so-called Dark Ages, a patchwork of small, warring Saxon kingdoms, each ruled by a king who held power only as long as his arm was strong and his warriors were loyal. Life was isolated and intensely local. Most people lived in small, timber-framed farmsteads known as hams or tuns, surrounded by their fields and pastures. The forests were vast and dark, places of both practical resource and profound fear, home to wolves, wild boar, and, in the minds of the people, far more sinister inhabitants. The world was not just a physical place, it was a spiritual one layered with meaning. Every grove, every spring, every strangely shaped stone was believed to hold a spirit, a remnant of the old pagan gods or a new Christian demon. The line between the natural and the supernatural was thin, porous, and constantly negotiated. In this world, every rustle in the undergrowth at dusk, every unexplained illness in the livestock, every creak of the house timbers on a windy night carried a potential message. Was it just the wind, or was it a wight, a spirit? Was a child's fever a simple ailment or the mark of an evil eye? The explanations provided by the emerging Christian church existed alongside and often mixed with much older beliefs in charms, curses, and household spirits. This was the perfect psychological landscape for a haunting to take root. When something went wrong, when fear settled into the walls of a home, the people of this age had a ready-made vocabulary for it, a framework that said, yes, the unseen world can reach into your life. It is against this backdrop of tangible hardship and intangible dread that the first whispers of the Bell Witch began. A family, alone on their farmstead, would have had no modern science to turn to, only their faith, their folklore, and their growing, chilling certainty that they were not alone. Into this world of whispering forests and watchful spirits steps our family. They are not kings or warriors, their names lost to the formal histories, but they are remembered in the old tales as the Bell family. Think of a father, a mother, and their children, living and working on a timber and thatch farmstead somewhere in the green expanse of Wessex. Their life was one of relentless, familiar rhythm. The father and his sons would rise with the sun to tend the fields of barley and rye, or to shepherd their small flock of sheep through the clearings. The mother and daughters would manage the hearth, the dairy, the vegetable patch, and the endless spinning and weaving that clothed the family. Their wealth was measured in full storage pits for winter, healthy livestock, and a sturdy roof overhead. They were, by all accounts, utterly ordinary. They prayed at the small wooden church, they observed the old customs for a good harvest, and they worried about the same things as every family, the weather, sickness, and the safety of their children. This profound normality is the essential foundation of the entire legend, because when the strange events began, there was no drama in their past to explain it, no hidden scandal or great crime whispered about in the village. They were simply a family going about their lives, which makes what happened next so much more terrifying. The horror of the Bell Witch legend does not stem from a cursed noble in a gloomy castle, but from the violation of an everyday home. It suggests that the supernatural could reach into the most humble, the most simple, the most seemingly protected space, the heart of a family. By making the bells relatable, the story ensures its fear is universal. It asks a chilling question that resonates across centuries. What if it happened to you? What if the peace of your own home, the one place you feel safest, became the source of your deepest dread? The haunting begins not with a grand spectral apparition, but with a subtle, almost polite intrusion. The first signs were not of sight, but of sound. It began with a simple, unsettling rhythm in the quiet of the evening, a persistent knocking on the thick oak door of their longhouse. At first, the father might have dismissed it as a loose shutter banging in the wind or a curious animal. But the knocking had a pattern to it, a deliberate tap, tap, tap that would pause as if waiting for a response and then begin again on a different wall. Soon, the sounds migrated indoors. The family would hear scratching from within the wattle and daub walls, a dry, insistent scraping that suggested something was trapped inside, trying to claw its way out. Yet when they pressed an ear to the plaster or lit a rushlight to investigate, they would find nothing, no hole, no nest, just smooth, cold wall. The ordinary nighttime symphony of their home, the creak of timber and the rustle of thatch, was now underscored by this alien percussion. These noises transformed their safe haven into a place of constant tension. Every evening brought a vigil, a waiting for the inexplicable to start its performance. The confusion must have been profound. They checked for rats, for badgers digging under the foundation, for branches rubbing the roof. Every logical explanation was tested and found wanting. The sounds obeyed no natural law, appearing in different locations at different times with an intelligence that felt mocking. This was not a random occurrence, it was a communication, and its message was one of intrusion. Then came the sound that would give the haunting its name. On a night perhaps still and clear, a new tone cut through the knocking and scratching. It was the deep, resonant, mournful toll of a bell. It echoed through the house, a sound both familiar and utterly impossible. Everyone knew the sound of the church bell from the village, calling them to prayer, but this was inside their home, a private, phantom peal. There was no bell in the house to strike, no metal object large enough to produce that profound, vibrating note. That sound stripped away any last pretense of a natural cause. A knocking could be a prank, scratching could be an animal, but the clear, solitary toll of a non-existent bell was a phenomenon of a different order. It was an auditory hallucination shared by an entire family, a ghostly signature. The atmosphere in the Bell homestead shifted from confusion to a deep, creeping dread. Their world, already full of unseen dangers, had now made itself acoustically known within their very walls. Sleep became fraught, conversations hushed. Every shadow cast by the hearth fire seemed to pulse with the memory of that phantom ring. The haunting had announced itself, not with a shriek, but with a knock, a scratch, and a toll that resonated in the bone as much as in the ear. What began as a nuisance was hardening into a terrifying reality. The phantom tolling of the bell left no room for doubt, but the entity was not content to remain a disembodied symphony of dread. Its next act was a deliberate, chilling escalation from the realm of sound into the terrifying world of sight. It began in the periphery, the place where human vision is weakest and the mind fills in the gaps. A family member, fetching water from the hearthside bucket, would catch a dark flicker from the corner of their eye, a swift movement in the empty space beside the loom. Another, lying awake at night, would stare into the gloom and see a patch of deeper shadow in the corner that seemed to shift and pulse against the steady darkness. These were the first visual whispers, so fleeting they could be dismissed as tricks of the firelight or a weary mind. But they happened too often to too many people in the full and terrible quiet that now filled the house. Then the shadows began to hold their shape. The dark patch in the corner would linger, resolving into a vague, human-like form, a silhouette that seemed to drink the light from the room. It had no distinct features, no face, no limbs one could clearly define, yet its presence was a cold, heavy weight in the air. It was often seen near the threshold of the main room or standing motionless at the foot of a sleeping pallet, a silent sentinel of malice. The abstract fear of strange noises crystallized into the visceral terror of being watched by something that stood just outside the fire's comforting glow. The family's home was no longer just acoustically invaded, it was visually shared. Finally, the apparition gathered the courage, or perhaps the spite, to be seen clearly. In the most harrowing accounts, the form gained definition. Several members of the Bell family reported seeing the figure of an old woman. She was described as haggard and bent, clothed in tattered, grey garments that seemed to blend with the smoke and shadows. Her face was often obscured, but the sense of her gaze was a physical chill. In other tellings, the spirit remained a more amorphous, malevolent presence, a coalescing mist that swirled with a faint internal light, sometimes taking on a bestial, crouching shape. The specific form mattered less than the profound reality of it. This was no longer a bump in the night or a trick of the light. It was a thing, it occupied space. It had intention. This visual confirmation shattered the last remnants of the family's rational world. The haunting was no longer a question of what they were hearing. It was now a matter of what they were seeing with their own eyes together. The terror became absolute and inescapable. An unexplained sound can breed anxiety, but a shared visual apparition breeds a primal, gut-level horror. The enemy had a face, or the suggestion of one. It moved from being a disturbing phenomenon to being a resident, a hostile, unwelcome member of the household who observed their fear and fed upon it. Their sanctuary was now a gallery where they were both the audience and the exhibit, forever on display for a silent, spectral judge. The haunting had fully manifested, and with that visibility came a terrifying new phase, one of direct interaction. News of the haunting did not stay confined within the Bell family's walls for long. In a world where every homestead was connected by winding footpaths and the shared labor of harvests, gossip traveled as swiftly as the wind through the barley. Whispers began at the village well and the blacksmith's forge. Had you heard about the noises at the Bell stead, the phantom bell, the shadow in the corner? The community, bound by both faith and deep-seated superstition, could not let such a profound disturbance go unexplained. They needed a story, a reason, a name for the terror that had taken root in their midst. And so, the people of Wessex began to construct an identity for the entity, weaving together threads of local memory, Christian doctrine, and much older fears. The most persistent and human explanation to emerge from the local talk was that the spirit was a ghost, not a random phantom, but the specific, vengeful soul of a local woman wronged in life. In the retellings, she was often described as a solitary figure, perhaps a wise woman who knew the secrets of herbs and healing, a midwife who had helped bring many of the village children into the world. But in a bad year, when crops failed or a child fell sick after she had visited, suspicion could curdle into accusation. The gossip suggested that this woman had been accused of witchcraft, driven out by fear and hatred, and had died in misery, cursing the community that shunned her. Now her spirit had returned, not to the village as a whole, but to a single family, perhaps one she felt had betrayed her most deeply. This theory gave the haunting a tragic, narrative logic. It was not a random act of supernatural malice, but a personal vengeance from beyond the grave, a story as old as human conflict itself. It transformed the Bell family's home from a random target into a focal point for a much older sin, making their suffering a form of dark inheritance. Other explanations reached further back, into the pagan past that still lingered in the forest groves. Some elders muttered that the entity was not a human ghost at all, but a land spirit angered by the family's presence. Had the Bells built their home over a sacred spring or cut down an ancient guardian tree without making the proper offerings? In this view, the haunting was a punishment for disrespect, a reminder from the old gods of the land that they had not been entirely displaced by the new Christian God. The phantom bell itself could be seen as a cruel mockery of the church's call to prayer, a pagan spirit ringing its own blasphemous summons. Then there was the official explanation offered by the trembling priest from the nearest church. To him, this was no local ghost or nettled nature spirit. This was a demon, a pure evil sent to test the faith of the Christian family or to punish them for some hidden moral failing. The knocking, the scratching, the disembodied voice all fit perfectly within the church's teachings on diabolical infestation. A demon needed no human history, no wronged life to justify its presence. Its motive was simply corruption and terror for its own sake. This interpretation was perhaps the most terrifying of all, for it framed the struggle in cosmic terms, a battle for souls happening in a simple timber-framed house. Each of these theories, the vengeful ghost, the angered pagan spirit, the Christian demon, tells us less about the entity itself and more about the people trying to understand it. Their speculation was a mirror held up to their own deepest fears of past sins, of a landscape still alive with old powers, of a devil waiting to prey upon the unwary. The legend of the bell, which was no longer just a family's private nightmare, it was becoming a communal property, a story shaped and colored by every person who told it. The haunting had escaped its physical boundaries and now lived in the imagination of an entire community, which meant the pressure on the Bell family was about to intensify beyond anything they had yet experienced. The spirit now moved beyond sight and sound into the realm of touch. The malicious presence in the Bell home was no longer content to be a spectator. It became an active participant, turning their domestic world into a theater of violence. This marked the terrifying transition from a haunting to what we would now call a poltergeist infestation, where the unseen force began to interact physically with the living. It started with small, invasive violations. A family member would feel a sudden, sharp pinch on their arm while sitting quietly by the fire, the skin reddening as if gripped by strong, invisible fingers. Another would be gently walking across the room only to have their hair yanked violently from behind, a painful tug that left them stumbling and crying out in shock and pain. These were not random aches, they were targeted, intelligent assaults meant to inflict discomfort and, more importantly, to demonstrate the entity's power over their very bodies. The home was no longer just visually shared, it was tactilely hostile. The attack soon escalated to involve the objects around them. A wooden bowl left securely on a shelf would suddenly fly across the room as if thrown by an angry hand, splintering against the far wall. A spinning wall or a cooking pot would levitate for a moment before crashing to the packed earth floor. Furniture, heavy oak benches and stools would scrape across the room of their own accord, their legs groaning against the ground. The family lived in a state of constant flinching, never knowing when or where the next projectile would originate. Meal times became fraught as a loaf of bread might be snatched from the table. Sleep was nearly impossible, with blankets being torn from bodies in the dead of night. This was more than fear, it was a state of siege. Their most basic tools of survival, their bowls, their fire irons, their very furniture, had been turned against them, animated by a malicious will. The psychological toll of this constant harassment was devastating. Every corner of their home, every familiar object now held potential danger. The hearth, the symbolic heart of the home and source of warmth and light, became just another place where a burning ember might leap from the fire toward them. The simple act of fetching water from the bucket required a wary glance in all directions. Trust in the stability of their world evaporated. If a stool could move on its own and an invisible hand could strike you, what law of reality still held true? The family members grew pale and hollow-eyed from lack of sleep, jumping at every sound, their nerves stretched to breaking point. They were prisoners in their own home, a home that had become a living, breathing enemy. The entity was not trying to drive them out. It seemed to delight in trapping them inside, in watching their spirit break under the relentless, unpredictable torment. With no escape and no explanation that could stop the violence, the Bell family was pushed toward a desperate and dangerous conclusion. If they could not fight the manifestation itself, they would have to seek out and confront whatever source had given it life, a quest that would lead them out of their home and into the shadowy heart of local rumor and ancient blame. With their home turned against them and their sanity fraying, the Bell family had only one place left to turn: the church. In a world where faith was the ultimate shield against the darkness, the representatives of God held the only recognized authority to confront such a diabolical infestation. A message was sent, likely carried by a terrified child or a grim-faced neighbor, to the nearest priest. Whether he was a local man who knew the family or a traveling monk from a nearby monastery, his arrival would have been a moment of desperate hope. He came bearing the tools of his office: a vial of holy water, a simple wooden cross, perhaps a relic of a saint wrapped in cloth, and the sacred words of the Latin rites. To the family huddled outside their own threshold, he represented divine order, a force that could cleanse the corruption festering within their walls. The initial rites were likely ones of blessing and purification. The priest would have moved through the dim, tense rooms, flicking holy water onto the walls, the hearth, the sleeping pallets, tracing the sign of the cross in the air as he invoked the protection of Christ and the saints. He would have prayed for the evil to depart, to return to the shadows from whence it came. For a moment, perhaps there was a fragile peace. The oppressive atmosphere might have felt lighter, the constant tension easing as the holy words echoed in the space. But according to the legend, this peace was a cruel illusion, a breath held before the storm. The entity within was not intimidated, it was insulted. The direct challenge of holy authority seemed to ignite a deeper, more furious malice. Where the family had been victims of harassment, they now became targets of a wrathful performance meant to mock the priest and his God. The response was swift and terrifying. As the priest continued his prayers, the phantom bell would toll with a deafening, discordant clang, drowning out his voice. The holy water, meant to burn evil, might be flung back from an unseen surface to splash the priest himself. Objects previously moved in secret now flew with violent intent, not just falling but aiming for the religious man, as if to drive him physically from the home. In some versions of the tale, the spirit found its voice in this moment of confrontation. It did not scream or roar, but spoke in a guttural, mocking whisper that seemed to come from the very walls, twisting the Latin prayers into blasphemous echoes or hurling insults at the frightened cleric. The failure of the exorcism was absolute and humiliating. The priest, pale and shaken, would have had to retreat, his faith shaken, his rituals proven powerless. For the Bell family, this was the deepest cut of all. The one institution that promised salvation from evil had been defeated on their own soil. Their last bastion of hope crumbled, reinforcing a horrifying new reality. They were not facing a simple ghost or a nettled spirit, but a power so profound it could defy the Holy Church itself. This was not just an unstoppable evil, it was an evil that took pleasure in demonstrating its supremacy over the divine. The family was now truly alone, trapped with a presence that had proven itself stronger than heaven itself. Their world shrank to the four walls of a cursed house, and with formal avenues of help exhausted, they would be forced to listen more closely to the fearful whispers of their neighbors, whispers that pointed not to the church, but to the dark, silent woods and a name spoken only in dread. The silence that followed the failed exorcism was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, waiting silence, thick with the knowledge that the thing in the house had won and now knew it. This victory seemed to grant it a new and terrible confidence. For the entity haunting the Bell family, sound had been its first language, from knocks to the tolling bell. Now it learned to speak. It began not with words, but with breath. In the dead of night, a family member lying rigid in their bed would feel a cold exhalation against their ear, a sigh that carried the scent of damp earth and decay. Then came the whispers, soft at first, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. They were indistinct, a susurration of malice just below the threshold of understanding, always coming from just behind a listener's shoulder or from within the empty space of a corner. The terror of an unseen presence is one thing. The terror of an unseen presence that is trying to tell you something is infinitely worse. It was learning to communicate, and its first lessons were in cruelty. The whispers soon coalesced into clear, intelligible speech. The voice was often described as a harsh, rasping croak, like stone grinding on stone, though at times it could mimic the lighter tones of a woman or even the frightened voice of a child. Its words were weapons, meticulously chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage. It did not rant or rave, it spoke with a cold, precise malice. It would hurl insults at the father, questioning his strength and his ability to protect his family. It would mock the mother's prayers, repeating her most desperate pleas back to her in a twisted, sing-song parody. But its most devastating attacks were reserved for the revelation of secrets. The witch's voice would recite things it had no earthly way of knowing. It whispered of a hidden argument between husband and wife from years past, of a petty theft a child had committed and never confessed, of a private shame or a hidden fear that each person held locked in their heart. Imagine the sheer violation of hearing your most intimate guilt, your most vulnerable moment, spoken aloud by a disembodied voice in the dark. The home was no longer just physically unsafe. It was a place where privacy was impossible, where every silent thought felt exposed. Legend preserves fragments of this horrific dialogue. To a son trembling by the hearth, it might say, "You still dream of the you let wander into the wolf's wood. Her bones are white now, but your cowardice is green." To the father, it would hiss, "Your axe is sharp for the oak, but dull for the true shadow that drinks your courage each night." These statements were not just threats, they were cryptic, poetic barbs that showed an intimate knowledge of the family's daily life and inner turmoil. The entity seemed to watch constantly, learning their weaknesses, then using their own memories and fears as ammunition. This transformed the haunting from an external assault into an internal war. The family members began to doubt not just their environment, but themselves and each other. If the witch knew a secret, who else might it tell? Could they trust that their private words to one another were truly private? The voice sowed seeds of paranoia that grew in the dark soil of their shared terror. The ultimate escalation was the direct threat. The voice moved past insults and revelations into prophecy of doom. It would promise specific horrors, whispering to a child, "The river will claim you before the next moon turns," or telling the mother, "The fire that cooks your meat will feast on your hair." These were not vague warnings of misfortune, but graphic, personal predictions of violent ends. The psychological torture was now complete. Every trip to the river for water became a potential death sentence. Every night spent near the hearth carried a new layer of dread. The entity was no longer merely a poltergeist throwing pots. It was a puppeteer pulling the strings of their deepest anxieties, forcing them to live each day waiting for its promises to come true. This ability to speak, to engage, to personalize its torment made the Bell Witch more than a ghost story. It created a relationship, a horrific bond between the haunted and the haunter, a dialogue of despair that echoed within the timbers of their home long after the last cruel word was spoken. With communication established, the haunting entered its most purposeful and destructive phase, as the entity began to dictate the terms of the family's existence with a chilling, specific goal in mind. The witch's voice was a poison seeping from the house into the very soil of the farm. Its malice, once confined to the terror within four walls, now flowed outward, staining the land the Bell family depended upon for survival. The haunting had evolved from a personal torment into an environmental curse, and the first victims were the most innocent and vulnerable creatures on the farm, the livestock. A prized milk cow, healthy and placid one evening, would be found stiff and cold in her stall at dawn, her eyes wide with a fear she could not express. There were no marks of predation, no signs of bloat or illness anyone could name. sheep huddled together for warmth would simply stop breathing in the night. A trusted plough horse might begin to tremble uncontrollably, refusing to enter its familiar stable, sweating and wild-eyed until it collapsed from exhaustion. These were not random acts of nature, they felt like targeted strikes. The entity was dismantling the family's wealth and security animal by animal, demonstrating its power over life and death in the most economically devastating way possible. The family's anguish was now compounded by a practical terror, watching their means of survival literally die around them. Then the curse reached the fields. A stand of barley, green and promising in the spring, would wither overnight as if scorched by an invisible, localized frost, while the crops on a neighbor's adjacent plot stood tall and healthy. Vegetable patches were blighted, their leaves curling into blackened crisps. Fruit trees would drop their unripe bounty in a single, silent shower. It was as if the land itself had been sickened, a malignancy radiating from the haunted house. Where the family once looked to their acres with hope at harvest time, they now saw only a landscape of failure, a visual proof of the curse's breadth. The pall of misfortune grew so thick it seemed to seep beyond the property's boundaries. Neighbors who lent tools to the Bells might find them broken upon return. A traveler passing too close to the Bell land could swear their cartwheel hit a stone that wasn't there, snapping an axle. Stories began to circulate of a strange, unseasonable chill that clung to the path leading to their farmstead, even on a warm summer's day. The Bell property became a place to be avoided, a blot on the local map. This expansion of the hauntings effects was a critical turning point in the legend. It transformed the entity from a ghost, a spirit tied to a person or a place, into a witch in the full, feared sense of the word. A ghost might rattle chains and moan, but a witch commanded the natural world. She could blight and sicken, she could curse the land and the beasts upon it. This was a being of active, creative malice, not just a remnant of a tragic past. By attacking the fertility of the land and the health of the animals, the witch was striking at the Saxon family's very identity, which was rooted in their ability to work and steward the land. To be a farmer whose land would not grow and whose animals would not thrive was a profound spiritual and social failure. The curse made them outcasts in a new, more profound way, their misfortune seen as contagious. The community's fear curdled into a wary, passive shunning. The Bell family was now trapped in a double isolation, prisoners inside a haunted home and exiles on a dying farm, while the shadow over Wessex grew longer and colder. A curse that could sicken the land was a story too powerful to remain contained. As the Bell family's plight deepened, their private nightmare began a slow, inexorable journey into the public imagination, transforming from a whispered hearth tale into a regional legend. This was the age before printing presses, before newspapers, where news traveled on foot and rumor was the primary currency of information. The main highways for this kind of story were the people constantly moving through the landscape, the peddlers with their packs of needles and ribbons, the drovers herding cattle to distant markets, and most importantly, the pilgrims traveling to holy sites like Glastonbury or Canterbury. These travelers were the medieval internet, nodes in a vast, slow network of human communication. A peddler stopping for a night's shelter at a tavern just outside the afflicted area would hear the local gossip, his eyes widening over a mug of ale as a farmer recounted the latest horror, the phantom bell or the blighted field. He would carry that story with him to the next village, the next county, retelling it for a price of a meal or simply for the status of being a bearer of fascinating, terrible news. With each retelling, the story adapted. A pilgrim already in a mindset attuned to signs, omens, and divine punishment might emphasize the demonic aspect, framing the Bell Witch as a test of faith for the entire region. A traveling minstrel might hear the tale and weave it into a ballad, adding rhythmic structure and poetic embellishment to make it more memorable, perhaps giving the witch a more tragic, romantic origin. The core facts, the family, the noises, the voice, the curse on the land remained, but the details bloomed with each new narrator. The number of children in the family might grow, the witch's insults might become more elaborate, the list of dead livestock might expand. This was not considered lying, it was the natural process of oral storytelling, where a tale is polished by countless tellings like a stone smoothed in a river. In this way, the specific terror of one homestead became a shared cultural property, a benchmark for supernatural horror. To say a place was haunted was one thing, but to say it was like the Bell Stead was to invoke an entire lexicon of fear, a shorthand everyone in Wessex and beyond began to understand. The story functioned as a warning, a mystery, and a form of dark entertainment. It gave a shape and a name to the formless anxieties of the age, the fear of a hostile landscape, the terror of invisible malice, the vulnerability of the isolated home. As the legend spread, it ceased to belong solely to the suffering family and began to belong to everyone who feared the dark, ensuring that long after the events themselves had faded into the past, the echo of that phantom bell would keep tolling in the minds of 1,000 listeners. But legends rarely spring from nothing. Could this story, for all its spectral bells and whispering shadows, contain a tiny, hard grain of historical truth? To answer that, we must sift through the dust of centuries, searching for a real family and a real place. The first and most obvious challenge is the name itself. Bell is not a typical Saxon surname from that early period. Names were often patronymic, like Wolfston's son, or occupational, like the blacksmith or the baker. The name Bell, referring to a bell ringer or a bell maker, is more likely to have emerged later as parishes grew and church bells became more common. This suggests the family name in the story may be a later addition, a placeholder for a forgotten lineage. So if not the Bells, who might they have been? We look to the records that survived the chaos of the early medieval world. Church records from abbeys like Glastonbury or Winchester sometimes note disputes over land, lists of tithes paid, or even reports of strange occurrences deemed diabolical. Local chronicles, often kept by monastic scribes, might mention a plague, a famine, or a notable crime in a specific hamlet. A diligent search through these fragile parchments might reveal a tantalizing fragment. Perhaps an entry from the 8th or 9th century notes a family on a remote farmstead in Wessex seeking the blessing of a bishop due to a great disturbance of spirits plaguing their home. Maybe a land grant describes a parcel of earth transferred to the church because it was blighted and accursed, and no man would work it. These are the kinds of whispers we listen for. The problem is, such records are incredibly rare and often frustratingly vague. A scribe might note a family was afflicted without specifying why, leaving us to wonder if it was sickness, bandits, or something less tangible. The oral tradition, the very engine that kept the Bell Witch story alive, was the enemy of the written record. For every event written down on costly vellum, 1,000 more were only ever spoken around the hearth, changing with each winter's telling. So let us consider a different possibility. What if the haunting is not a record of a supernatural event, but a supernatural explanation for a very real human tragedy? Imagine a family isolated on their farm. A mysterious illness sweeps through the household, perhaps a slow poison from ergot fungus on their rye, causing hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. To a terrified neighbor, the family's screams and strange behavior would not look like disease but like possession. Their livestock die from a murrain they cannot understand. Their crops fail from a blight invisible to the eye. In an age without germ theory, the simplest, most terrifying explanation is a curse, a witch's malice given form. The phantom noises could be the auditory hallucinations of the sick, or the sounds of the illness weakened house settling into neglect. The story of the vengeful old woman could be a garbled memory of a real local healer who was blamed when her remedies failed. In this light, the legend becomes a profound act of collective sense-making. It takes the random, brutal cruelty of nature, of sickness and bad luck, and gives it a face, a motive, and a story. It transforms unbearable, meaningless suffering into a narrative with a villain, however spectral. That narrative, repeated over generations, hardens into the tale we know. The search for a historical bell witch, then, may not end with finding a ghost in a ledger. It may end with recognizing the very human need to explain the unexplainable, to dress the cold fear of misfortune in the chilling but familiar robes of a haunting. The world of the Bell family was not one of simple superstition, but of a fundamental, unshakable reality. For them, and for everyone in their time, the supernatural was not a separate category of experience. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life. The medieval mind did not see a clear border between the physical world and the spiritual one. Instead, these two realms existed in a constant, intimate dialogue, and every event, good or bad, was a message in that conversation. A sudden hailstorm that destroyed a crop was not just bad weather. It could be a sign of divine displeasure or the work of a malevolent spirit. A child's fever was not merely an illness. It could be the result of the evil eye, a curse cast by a jealous neighbor. This worldview made the events at the Bell homestead not only possible but entirely logical. In a universe where invisible forces were as real as the rain, a haunting was a dreadful but understandable occurrence. Central to this understanding was the concept of witchcraft itself. Today, we often think of witches as fictional characters or as victims of historical persecution. But in the early medieval period, the belief in harmful magic was a practical and deeply held fear. Witchcraft was seen as a perversion of natural order, a way for a person to harness unseen powers to inflict harm. This magic was not about flying on broomsticks or casting dramatic spells. It was often quiet, insidious, and deeply personal. It involved curses whispered over a lock of hair, charms buried at a property boundary, or poisons brewed from toxic herbs. When livestock sickened for no apparent reason, when butter refused to churn, when a series of minor accidents plagued a household, the most immediate suspicion for many was maleficium, harmful sorcery. The idea that a human being, often an outcast or a person with a grudge, could project their will into the world to cause such specific misery gave a face and a motive to random suffering. It made the chaotic feel ordered, even if that order was terrifying. This belief was amplified by the teachings of the early Christian church, which was still working to convert the pagan countryside. The church provided a powerful new framework, identifying these malicious forces not just as rogue magic, but as the work of demons. Every unexplained misfortune, every strange sound in the night, could be interpreted as evidence of Satan's minions at work, testing the faithful or punishing the sinful. This created a potent fusion of older folk beliefs and new religious doctrine. A local wise woman who knew the old healing charms could easily be recast as a servant of the devil if her cures failed or if she fell out of favor. The entity plaguing the Bell family, therefore, could be understood through multiple overlapping lenses. To some, it was the ghost of a wronged witch. To others, it was a demon wearing her memory like a mask. To the family themselves, trapped in the heart of it, the distinction may have mattered very little. The result was the same, a tangible, intelligent evil that had targeted their home. This mindset removes the cushion of modern skepticism when we examine the legend. We cannot ask why the community didn't seek a rational, scientific explanation, because for them, the supernatural explanation was rational. It fit perfectly within their understanding of how the universe operated. The phantom bell was not a psychological phenomenon, it was a spiritual alarm. The whispering voice was not a hallucination, it was a direct communication from a malicious intelligence. The blight on their land was not a soil fungus, it was the visible stain of a curse. This perspective transforms the Bell Witch story from a quaint folktale into a genuine historical record of terror. It shows us how people processed trauma and loss in an age where the invisible world was always just a breath away. ready to make its presence known with a knock on the door, a withering of the grain, or the cold, whispered knowledge of a secret shame. Their fear was not a product of ignorance, but a reasoned response to the world as they knew it. The phantom Bell of Wessex was not a solitary voice in the dark. Across the misty landscapes of Britain, the sound of a bell where no bell should be rings through countless local legends, a shared vocabulary of the supernatural. This recurring motif tells us that the terror experienced by the Bell family tapped into a deep cultural nerve. Take the haunting tale of Lyoness, the mythical lost land said to lie sunken beneath the waves off the coast of Cornwall. Fishermen and sailors have long claimed that on still, foggy mornings, they can hear the distant, mournful tolling of church bells rising from the deep. This sound is the ghost of a drowned civilization, a kingdom swallowed by the sea in a single catastrophic night. The bells of Lyoness are not attached to a haunting, but to a cataclysm, a sonic memorial for a world that vanished. They signal profound, irreversible loss on a grand scale, a tragedy written into the geography itself. In stark contrast, many British villages hold stories of a phantom death knell. Here, the bell is not a relic of the past, but a prophet of the future. The story goes that just before a person dies, a single, clear bell toll will be heard by their family, even if the local church is miles away or the bell ropes are still. This omen is personal and specific, a chilling private announcement from the unseen world that a soul is soon to depart. It is a sound of fate, not malice, a supernatural signal woven into the natural order of life and death. So where does the Bell Witch's bell fit within this spectrum? Unlike the sunken bells of Lyoness, it is not an echo of a past disaster, but an active present torment. And unlike the prophetic death knell, its tolling is not a one-time omen for a single death, but a repeated instrument of terror aimed at the living. The Wessex bell is a tool of engagement. It does not mourn a loss or announce a destiny. It creates a nightmare. It is the centerpiece of a personal siege, a sound that transforms a home from a sanctuary into a prison. This comparison reveals the unique cruelty of the Wessex legend. Other phantom bells are often environmental or fateful, part of the landscape or the life cycle. The Bell Witch's bell is domestic and intimate. It invaded the one place where the family should have been safest, turning the very concept of home against them. The common thread, however, is undeniable. In the folklore of Britain, the clear, resonant sound of a bell became a universal signal for the crossing of boundaries. It marked the line between land and sea, between life and death, and in the case of our Saxon family, between the natural world and a realm of active, intelligent malice. The bell was a sound everyone understood, a call to prayer, a marker of time, a gatherer of the community. To hear that sound divorced from its source, twisted into a message of fear, was to experience a fundamental betrayal of order. This shared folklore deepens the mystery. It suggests the Bell Witch story was not an isolated fiction, but a powerful local variation on a theme that resonated across the entire island. Our ancestors were using the same symbolic language to express their deepest fears of loss, fate, and invasion. The legend of the Bell family becomes even more compelling when we hear its central terror echoing from the cliffs of Cornwall to the glens of Scotland, a chorus of phantom chimes reminding us that some fears are written into the very land and its stories. The terror within the Bell home feels absolute, but a modern mind cannot help but search for a different kind of ghost, one that haunts the human psyche itself. What if the true haunting was not a specter from the woods, but a manifestation of the family's own unraveling minds? In our age, we possess a new vocabulary for old fears, a psychological lens that offers a starkly different interpretation of the legend. Consider the sheer, grinding stress of their existence. This was a family living in profound isolation, their survival balanced on the knife edge of each harvest, surrounded by a dark forest they believed was alive with hostile forces. The constant, low-grade anxiety of that life could have been the fertile ground for a shared delusion. When the first strange sound echoed in the night, perhaps a creaking beam or a fox scratching outside, the power of suggestion, fueled by fear and folklore, could have transformed it into the deliberate knock of a witch. Once the idea of a haunting took root, it would have colored every subsequent experience, a self-fulfilling prophecy of dread. This phenomenon, where the beliefs and anxieties of a group shape their collective perception of reality, is what we now call mass psychogenic illness or mass hysteria. In such a state, one person's genuine fright, a scream upon hearing an odd noise, can trigger identical physical symptoms in others, from headaches and dizziness to the sensation of being choked or pinched by invisible hands. The family's reports of feeling cold breaths and sharp pinches align eerily well with these documented cases. The entity's voice, that cruel, whispering intelligence, could be explained as an auditory hallucination. In states of extreme fear and sleep deprivation, the brain can manufacture sounds, especially in a quiet environment where the mind strains to interpret every rustle. A parent lying awake consumed with worry over a sick child or a failing crop might hear their own deepest fears verbalized in the sigh of the wind through the thatch. These internal anxieties, given a voice by a stressed mind, would feel utterly external, a supernatural confirmation of their private torment. Then there is the poltergeist activity, the flying objects and moving furniture. Parapsychologists have long noted a curious pattern. Such intense physical disturbances are frequently associated with households containing adolescents. The theory suggests that the unconscious psychic energy of a young person in profound emotional distress, someone feeling powerless, angry, or trapped, can somehow express itself outwardly, affecting the physical environment. In the Bell family, a teenage son or daughter, burdened by the oppressive isolation and the constant fear, could have been the unwitting epicenter. Their unspoken rage and frustration might not have manifested as outright rebellion, but as a series of unexplained, violent events that mirrored their inner turmoil. The moving objects were not thrown by a ghost, but by a living, suffering soul whose distress had taken a bizarre and terrifying physical form. Even the terrifying nocturnal visitations, the old woman at the bedside, could be reframed through the lens of sleep paralysis. This common but frightening phenomenon occurs when the brain wakes from a dream state before the body's paralysis. A natural function that prevents us from acting out our dreams has worn off. The sleeper is awake, aware, but utterly unable to move. This state is almost always accompanied by intense hallucinations, a crushing pressure on the chest, and the overwhelming sense of a malevolent presence in the room. For a medieval mind already primed with stories of witches and night riders, this experience would have one terrifying explanation: a witch was sitting on your chest, holding you down, visiting you in the night. What was a neurological glitch becomes, in the telling, a supernatural assault. This psychological interpretation does not diminish the family's suffering, it deepens it. It suggests their horror was no less real for being born from within. They were victims not of a demon, but of the perfect storm, crushing environmental stress, deep-seated cultural beliefs, and the mysterious, sometimes terrifying, capacities of the human mind under extreme duress. Their haunting was a language, a desperate and distorted expression of fears they could not otherwise name. Yet the earth itself holds secrets that can sing. Beneath the rolling hills of Wessex, a different kind of haunting may have been at work, one born not of spirit or mind, but of geology. Modern science offers a compelling and elegant explanation for the legend's most persistent and terrifying feature, the phantom bell. The ground we walk on is not silent. It is a symphony of hidden pressures and moving forces, capable of producing sounds that would seem utterly supernatural to an 8th century ear. Consider the network of underground water. Wessex is a land of chalk downs and limestone rock types that are easily dissolved by slightly acidic rainwater, forming vast, hidden networks of caves, tunnels, and aquifers. When water moves swiftly through these subterranean channels, especially during periods of heavy rain or seasonal flooding, it can create powerful resonances. The rushing water acts like a bow on a colossal cello string, causing the rock around it to vibrate. These vibrations travel upwards through the soil and bedrock, and when they reach a hollow space or a particular rock formation on the surface, they can be translated into audible sound. That sound is often a low, humming drone or a deep, resonant tone, remarkably similar to the toll of a large bell. If the Bell homestead was situated above such an active geological feature, the family would have been living directly atop a natural amplifier for the Earth's hidden music. The sounds would not be constant but sporadic, triggered by weather events they could not directly observe underground. One night, after a distant downpour, the aquifer beneath them might shift, and a deep, mournful peal would emanate from the very foundations of their home. Another explanation lies in seismic activity. England is not known for dramatic earthquakes, but it is far from seismically silent. Minor tremors, far too faint to be felt as shaking, occur with surprising frequency. These microtremors involve the slow grinding and settling of tectonic plates deep below the surface. This grinding can generate low-frequency acoustic waves, sounds that travel through the rock. When these waves encounter a specific geological structure, like a vertical fissure or a buried metallic ore deposit, they can be converted into a clear, ringing tone that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. To a family living in a timber and daub house which would act as a sounding board for these vibrations, the effect would be a bell tolling from within their walls. Even the wind, that constant companion of the Saxon landscape, could be the conductor. The region is dotted with natural rock formations, sea caves along the coast, and narrow, deep valleys. When wind blows across the mouth of a cave or through a particular crevice in a cliff face, it can create a steady, harmonic whistle known as an Aeolian tone. Under very specific conditions, with the right wind speed and direction, this whistle can deepen into a resonant, booming note that carries for miles. If an abandoned mine shaft or a natural limestone chimney existed near the Bell property, it could have functioned as a giant stone flute played by the weather, its song washing over the isolated farmstead on stormy nights. For us, these are fascinating natural phenomena. For the Bell family and their neighbors, they were messages from an invisible world. They had no concept of tectonic plates or acoustic resonance. Their framework for understanding the unexplainable was populated by spirits, demons, and witches. A deep, inexplicable sound emerging from the ground would not be a geological curiosity, it would be a sign. It would be interpreted as a hammer striking a phantom anvil in a fairy forge, or the tolling of a bell from a sunken church, or, most terrifyingly, the signature of a malevolent entity announcing its presence. The natural world provided the eerie soundtrack, and the human mind, steeped in myth and fear, provided the chilling narrative. The legend, in this light, becomes a stunning case of mistaken identity, where the ancient singing bones of the earth were heard as the harbinger of a witch's curse. That phantom bell, once a sound of pure terror, eventually found a new kind of life in the voices of poets and musicians. While no single, definitive ballad titled The Bell Witch of Wessex survives in a medieval manuscript, the haunting's core elements were precisely the kind of raw material that traveling minstrels and local storytellers thrived upon. These performers were the living libraries of their age, collecting fragments of news, tragedy, and wonder, then weaving them into verse and song to be traded for a meal or a night's lodging. A tale as potent as this one, with its clear structure of innocence violated, its dramatic escalation from noise to voice to curse, and its deeply human victims, was a narrative goldmine. The minstrel would have recognized its power immediately, shaping it to fit the familiar, rhythmic patterns of a folk ballad. He might have begun with a sorrowful refrain about the green fields of Wessex, setting a scene of peace before the fall. The verses would then chronicle the haunting not as a dry report, but as a series of vivid, emotional tableaus. The mysterious knocking became a rhythmic device within the song itself, a repeated line mimicking the tap, tap, tap on the door. The tolling of the bell provided a natural, mournful chorus, a moment for the singer's voice to drop into a lower, resonant register that would send a chill through the tavern audience. The witch's cruel whispers were transformed into direct, rhyming threats sung in a harsh, guttural tone, making the antagonist speak directly to the listeners. The dying livestock and blighted fields became symbols of a broken covenant with the land, their imagery sharpened for maximum poetic effect. In this process, the real family's nameless suffering gained a kind of archetypal grandeur. They became the Goodman Bell and his Lady Fair, their children 3 bonny babes, their home a stead once blessed, now bereft. The storyteller was not concerned with forensic accuracy, but with emotional truth and memorable delivery. This artistic adaptation served a crucial, unintended historical function. It preserved the legend. A dry chronicle entry about a disturbance on a farm might be copied once and sit forgotten on a monastery shelf. But a compelling song, one that gave people gooseflesh and made them lean closer to the fire, was repeated. It was taught by one singer to another, carried across county lines, and sung at harvest feasts for generations. With each performance, small changes crept in. A singer from a region with more forests might emphasize the witch's connection to a specific gnarled oak. Another, more devout, might insert a new verse where a brave priest brandishes a cross, only to be mocked by a disembodied laugh. The legend was no longer a fixed event, but a living story, evolving to reflect the fears and fascinations of each new audience. It became a piece of shared cultural property, a reference point. So, while we may not have an original 8th century ballad, echoes of this story likely resonate in later British folk traditions, in songs about vengeful fairy queens who blight crops, or in tales of phantom bells that ring for lost souls. The specific horror of one Saxon family was distilled into a potent narrative essence, ensuring that long after their farmstead returned to meadow, the memory of their haunting continued to be sung, a chilling melody passed down through the centuries. This transformation from personal trauma to popular art raises a final, profound question about the nature of the legend itself. If the story was shaped and reshaped by countless tellers, where does the historical truth actually reside? The legend lives in whispers and song, but could its truth lie buried in the earth? To find the Bell homestead is to search for a ghost in the landscape, a task for the patient science of archaeology rather than the quick thrill of a ghost hunt. What would an archaeologist armed with trowel and theory actually seek in the rolling fields of Wessex? The first clue would be the faint geometric scar of a building's footprint. They would look for the post holes of a Saxon longhouse, dark circles of disturbed soil where great timber uprights once stood, outlining a rectangular hall perhaps 20 meters long. Nearby, they'd expect to find the smaller, shallower pits of outbuildings, a weaving shed or a grain store. This pattern alone would tell a story of a family's ambition and labor, carving a home from the wilderness. But the story of the Bell, which requires more than just a home, it requires a home that met a terrible end. The archaeologist's trowel would therefore be searching for signs of a narrative written in the dirt, evidence of a sudden and traumatic abandonment. Imagine uncovering a hearth, its central fire pit still holding a layer of charcoal, but beside it, the shattered remains of cooking pots and wooden bowls, as if dropped in a panic and never retrieved. Perhaps they would find a valuable iron tool, a knife or a sickle left behind in a corner, something a fleeing family would almost certainly have taken if their departure was planned. More poignant still might be the discovery of animal bones in unusual contexts, not neatly butchered and discarded in a midden, but found within the living space, suggesting livestock died where they stood and were never cleared away. These are the silent testimonies of a life interrupted. The most tantalizing and most debated finds would be unusual artifact deposits that defy simple explanation. In a corner post hole, the team might uncover a collection of strange objects, a bundle of knotted cords, animal teeth, or oddly shaped stones. To a modern eye, it's rubbish, but to a medieval mind, these could be protective charms or, conversely, the cursed objects that invited the haunting in the first place. A single cow's skull buried deliberately under the threshold, or a cache of pierced stones hidden in the thatch, could be read as desperate attempts to ward off an evil that had already taken root. These are the physical echoes of the psychological terror described in the legend. Could modern technology ever pinpoint such a sight? Ground-penetrating radar, which sends pulses into the earth to map differences in soil density, could indeed reveal the ghostly outlines of buildings and pits without ever breaking the surface. Magnetometry could detect the faint magnetic signatures of long-collapsed hearths and burned areas. These tools allow us to scan a likely landscape, a secluded valley or a hill remote from known settlements, searching for the telltale geometry of a lonely farmstead. Finding it would be one thing, interpreting it another. The uncovered post holes and shattered pottery would never shout the name of a witch. They would only whisper of hardship, fear, and an abrupt end. The archaeologist's greatest challenge would be to resist the pull of the legend, to let the soil tell its own story, even as every unusual find seems to ring with the echo of a phantom bell. The search itself becomes a powerful metaphor, a journey to the very border where hard evidence dissolves into the mists of story, leaving us to wonder if some truths are meant to be felt in the bones of the land, not listed in a catalogue of finds. The same primal fear that echoed in a Saxon longhouse now resonates through our modern screens and pages. The archetype of the Bell Witch, a vocal entity tormenting a family within their own home, has proven endlessly adaptable, its medieval DNA woven into the fabric of contemporary horror. This is not a case of direct adaptation, but of shared narrative bones. The story's core formula, an isolated household, a malicious intelligence that communicates, and a curse that feels both personal and inescapable, provides a blueprint that modern storytellers instinctively follow. Consider the classic horror film Poltergeist. While set in a suburban American home, it mirrors the Wessex legend's progression perfectly. It begins with playful, curious phenomena, knocks and moving objects that quickly escalate into terrifying physical threats and the kidnapping of a child, much like the witch's attacks on the Bell family's security and well-being. The entity there is also a vocal, deceptive presence, using the familiar medium of a television to communicate its lies. The haunting is tied intrinsically to the land, revealing a historical injustice buried beneath the foundation, echoing the legend's themes of a past sin poisoning the present. In literature, Stephen King's vast bibliography is a testament to the power of this archetype. The Overlook Hotel in The Shining is a direct descendant of the Bell homestead. It is not just a building, but a sentient, malevolent location that targets a vulnerable family, preying on their fears and secrets. It communicates through visions and phantom voices, driving the father to violence and threatening to consume the child with psychic abilities. The terror is domestic, claustrophobic, and tied to the very walls around them. Even in television, series like The Haunting of Hill House explore this legacy. The Crane family's ordeal is defined by a house that is itself a character, a hungry entity that warps time and space, whispering to its inhabitants and forever binding their souls to its corrupted geometry. The modern haunted house story, in all its forms, owes a debt to that first terrified Saxon family. Our fascination persists because the fear remains universal. The violation of the home is the ultimate horror. We have swapped timber and thatch for drywall and smart devices, but the deep-seated dread of something speaking to us from within our own walls, something that knows our secrets and seeks to break us, is timeless. These modern retellings are not just entertainment, they are cultural rituals. They allow us to safely explore the oldest of questions from the safety of our sofas. What if the darkness outside is not nearly as frightening as the darkness that decides to move in? This enduring appeal suggests the Bell Witch was never just a ghost story, but a fundamental human parable about the fragility of sanctuary. Across the Atlantic and centuries later, a nearly identical spectre would find a new family to haunt. In the early 1800s, in the rural community of Adams, Tennessee, a farmer named John Bell began experiencing disturbances on his property. His family was tormented by a disembodied entity that began with knocking sounds and scratching on the walls. It soon escalated to physical violence, pulling hair, pinching, and throwing objects. This entity, like its Wessex predecessor, found a voice. It would sing hymns, quote scripture, and engage in lengthy, malicious conversations with the family and their neighbors, often revealing secrets and spewing venomous insults. It famously cursed John Bell himself, who later died under mysterious circumstances after drinking a strange liquid the entity claimed to have poisoned. The community, and eventually the wider world, came to know this tormentor by a chillingly familiar name, the Bell Witch. The parallels are too stark to ignore. Both hauntings center on a family named Bell. Both begin with inexplicable sounds before manifesting physical and vocal aggression. Both entities demonstrate a cruel, personal intelligence, targeting the patriarch and using knowledge of private affairs as a weapon. Most uncannily, both are remembered by the same title, a title not common in folklore elsewhere. So what does this mean? Is this a case of astonishing coincidence where two unrelated families on different continents suffered similar fates centuries apart? Or could it be a story that traveled, the legend of the Wessex Bell Witch carried in ballads and the memories of emigrants might have crossed the ocean with settlers? In the oral tradition, a story can lie dormant for generations, only to re-emerge when a new family in a new land experiences a similar trauma, their fear instinctively reaching for the nearest available narrative, a ready-made ghost story that perfectly fits their terror. Yet there is a third, more profound possibility. Perhaps the name and the specific details are coincidental, but the haunting archetype itself is universal. The story of a vocal poltergeist entity that targets a family within their home speaks to a fundamental human fear, the violation of our sanctuary by an intelligent, unseen malice. This archetype appears independently in cultures worldwide, from the myling of Scandinavia to the tile of Indonesia. The Bell Witch, in both its English and American incarnations, may simply be the Western expression of this deep-seated dread, a story our minds are primed to tell when the world becomes inexplicably hostile. Whether by chance, transmission, or archetype, the echo of that phantom bell proves some fears are not bound by geography or time. The phantom bell is not a sound unique to the mists of Wessex. This eerie motif resonates across continents and cultures, a shared note in humanity's symphony of the supernatural. In Japan, tales speak of yurei, spirits of the dead, who are said to ring the bells of abandoned mountain temples on foggy nights. The solitary, mournful peal signals not just a ghost, but a soul trapped between worlds, using the sacred instrument of a temple to make its sorrow heard. Across the Irish Sea, Celtic folklore is rich with the music of the Shia, the fairy folk. Their bells are not always ominous, but they are always otherworldly. The faint, silvery ringing of fairy bells was said to drift from beneath hollow hills or from deep within ancient forests, a sound that could lead a wanderer into enchantment or peril, marking a gateway to a realm outside of human time. In the Appalachian Mountains of America, settlers told of hearing phantom dinner bells ringing from empty hollows, a sound attributed to the ghosts of previous inhabitants or to mischievous spirits echoing the calls of long-vanished homesteads. Even in the maritime traditions, phantom bells toll from sunken ships, a last desperate signal from a crew claimed by the deep. This global chorus reveals something profound. The bell, in its physical form, is almost universally a tool of transition and communication. It calls the faithful to prayer, marks the hour, celebrates a wedding, or mourns a death. It is a sound that organizes human life, that pierces the mundane with a note of the sacred or the solemn. So when that same sound is divorced from its source, when it rings from empty air, from solid earth, or from beneath the waves, it represents a fundamental rupture in order. It is a transition with no visible ceremony, a communication from an unknown sender. The mind-seeking pattern instinctively fills the void with a story, a spirit, a witch, a fairy, a lost soul. Our ancestors were not merely frightened by a strange noise, they were interpreters of a broken code. The global prevalence of phantom bell legends tells us that the terror of the bell which taps into a deep, archetypal layer of human experience. It is the fear of a signal we cannot answer, a message from the dark that we are compelled, despite our dread, to try and understand. That final, unanswered toll of the bell is the legend's most powerful ingredient. The story persists not because it provides answers, but because it so masterfully denies them. Its endurance is a testament to a perfect, chilling recipe. At its heart is a profoundly relatable anchor, an ordinary family. This is not a tale of kings in haunted castles, but of a mother, a father, and their children. Their fears are our fears, safety for their loved ones, security for their home, trust in their own senses. By rooting the supernatural in such a domestic, everyday setting, the legend bypasses our skepticism and speaks directly to a primal nerve, the fear that our own sanctuary could turn against us. The haunting then escalates with a cruel, logical precision. It begins with curiosity, a simple knock. It builds through evidence, the shadow in the corner and the phantom bell. It culminates in violation with physical assaults and whispered secrets. This progression mirrors the way real terror unfolds, not as a single shock, but as a slow, dawning realization that the rules of your world no longer apply. Each stage pulls the audience deeper, making the unbelievable feel inevitable. The failure of the church is the moment the story shatters all hope of a neat resolution. When the priest retreats defeated, the narrative demolishes the ultimate authority of that age. It tells us that sometimes the darkness is simply stronger than the light we can bring to bear. There is no heroic exorcism, no sacred artifact that saves the day. This refusal to provide a clean victory is brutally authentic to the human experience of helplessness. We crave order, but the legend acknowledges chaos. Finally, the story simply stops. We are never told the ultimate fate of the Bell family. Did they abandon their home to the whispering shadows? Did they succumb to the curses? Did the entity eventually grow bored and depart? The silence that follows the tale is where the legend truly lives. In that space it leaves for our own imagination to fill with an ending. This unresolved quality transforms a historical anecdote into an eternal question. It taps directly into our most fundamental anxieties, the fear of the unknown, the terror of forces beyond our comprehension or control, and the vulnerability of the four walls we call home. Every generation that hears it subconsciously asks, what would I have done? Who would I have blamed? How would I have survived? The Bell Witch of Wessex endures because it is less about a ghost and more about us, a dark mirror held up to our timeless human dread. The rolling hills of Wessex still hold their ancient secrets. For anyone feeling the pull of this legend, the landscape itself is the destination. Modern Wessex is not a political kingdom but a region of southwest England, encompassing the counties of Hampshire, Dorset, Wiltshire, and parts of Somerset. This is a countryside that feels layered with time. You drive along narrow, hedge-lined lanes that follow the same routes as ancient trackways, past fields that have been tilled for over 1,000 years. The land rises and falls in great green swells, dotted with grazing sheep and crowned by lonely clumps of trees. These are the downs, the chalk hills that form the very bones of southern England. In the valleys, you find sleepy villages of honey-colored stone, their churches often built with stones taken from even older sacred sites. It is a place of deep quiet, broken only by the wind and birdsong, a silence that seems to invite whispers from the past. The ancient woodlands, like the New Forest or the remnants of Selwood, are pockets of primeval shadow. Walking beneath their canopy of ancient oaks, their trunks gnarled and mossy, you can understand how our ancestors saw these spaces as the domain of spirits. The light filters down in dappled shafts, and the undergrowth is thick and mysterious. It requires no great leap of imagination to picture a Saxon farmstead tucked into a clearing here, vulnerable and isolated, its timber walls the only barrier against the encircling forest. The atmosphere is not one of overt horror, but of a profound and watchful antiquity. You can stand on the crest of a downland hill, like those above Salisbury Plain, and look out over a landscape virtually unchanged in its fundamentals since the 8th century. The same wind sweeps across the grass, the same clouds race overhead, and the same sense of smallness in a vast, ancient land settles upon you. This evocative scenery is the true home of the Bell Witch legend. The story is not pinned to a single, verified location because it belongs to the feeling of the land itself. Any secluded valley with a hidden spring, any lonely farm at the end of a muddy track, any copse of trees that seems darker than it should could be the setting. The countryside of Wessex provides the perfect stage for the imagination to conjure the past, to hear a phantom bell on the breeze or sense a watching presence from the edge of a field. To visit is to walk into the legend, to understand that some stories are not just told about a place, but are born from its very soil and sky. Our journey through the mists of Wessex has taken us from a lonely Saxon farmstead to the very edges of human understanding. We began with a single, impossible sound, a phantom bell tolling in the dark, and followed its echoes through centuries. We walked with a terrified family as their home turned against them, listened as their community wove tales of vengeful ghosts and angered demons, and watched as their private nightmare blossomed into a regional legend. We then stepped back, applying modern lenses to this ancient fear, considering the psychological pressures of isolation, the strange music of the earth itself, and the universal archetype of the haunted home. Each perspective, from the medieval to the modern, offers a different key, yet none unlocks the final door. This is the enduring power of the Bell Witch legend, its perfect, haunting ambiguity. It refuses to be categorized. It sits stubbornly in the shadowy space between a historical event, a piece of folklore, and a psychological case study. It is all of these things, and therefore definitively none of them. We cannot prove a witch haunted that farm, but we cannot simply dismiss the profound, detailed terror that has echoed for over 1,000 years. In that unresolved tension, the story finds its immortality. These legends are more than just campfire tales, they are cultural fossils. They preserve the emotional landscape of our ancestors, mapping their deepest fears onto the physical world. When we listen to the story of the Bell family, we are not just hearing about knocks and whispers, we are hearing the palpable fear of a world filled with invisible, intelligent malice, where a bad harvest could feel like a curse and a strange sound could be a message from another realm. By grappling with their story, we better understand the weight they carried, the reality they inhabited, where the supernatural was a daily possibility. But these stories also hold up a mirror to us, our continued fascination, our need to dissect the legend with science and psychology, reveals our own timeless anxieties. We still fear the violation of our homes, the exposure of our secrets, and forces beyond our control. The setting has changed from timber and thatch to brick and Wi-Fi, but the core dread remains. The Bell Witch of Wessex endures because it speaks to that fear in a language that transcends time, a language of eerie sounds in the night and a presence that watches from the dark. What local ghost story haunts the landscape where you live? Is there a tale passed down in your family or town of a strange occurrence, a cursed place, or a lingering spirit? Share those stories in the comments below, and let us continue this exploration of the shadows together. For more deep dives into the mysteries of the medieval world and the legends that shaped it, be sure to subscribe.